What's happening, folks? Back with another reaction, back with another piece of J-drama score. This for a 2014 show that is actually translated a couple different ways into English. In the box set and soundtrack I have, it's translated as The Private Detective That I Don't Like, which stars Goriki Ayame and Tamaki Hiroshi, two of my favorite performers in the J-drama world, and who I had seen in other shows originally, which is what took me to discover this show when I was searching around on some of the buyers that some of the sellers that I've gotten J-drama from. In any case, the point is, it's also translated as Addicted to Mystery, which very much makes sense, as much as the title that we see here, in that one of the main characters, Goriki Ayame's character, is absolutely addicted to mystery and wishes that everyday mundane investigations and crime cases were as exciting and as complicated and mysterious as stories in detective novels and detective TV shows. So she's always trying to will the complexity or mysterious nature of detective novels into real life, which is Tamaki Hiroshi's character is a private detective who prefers simple cases, finding out what happened to a lost pet or investigating a potential affair among, a married spouse, but who gets drawn into murder cases, much to his chagrin, because there's an opportunity to maybe get paid well for it by Goriki Ayame's character. So Addicted to Mystery, Private Detective That I Don't Like, whatever you call it, it's a very funny show. Unfortunately, the DVD box set has good subtitles for the first couple episodes, or maybe even the first three, but by episode 4, it falls down to a lower level, and while there's never anything that's truly impossible to discern, there are multiple sentences in the episodes after that where the grammar is a bit broken, the conjugation of a word isn't correct, or there's otherwise a weird translation, which my understanding is that in these box sets, when occasionally you get a translation that doesn't seem to make sense, it's often because the translators were probably Chinese speakers who were taking the Chinese rendering of the kanji and then translating that into English. So a phrase which in Japanese means, go for it, put your effort into it, work hard, is sometimes translated as get oil. And the first time you see that, it's like, wait, what? I don't really understand why they're saying to him get oil. And then you realize that, oh wait, it's part of this unfortunate telephone translational sequence. In any case, as I said, there's nothing that's impossible to figure out, and the episodes are still very enjoyable. It's definitely a comedy show. It's detective. There's even a hint of romance, so that's not really a main component of the show's atmosphere. Just a bit of a whiff, especially in the last couple episodes. Nevertheless, the main focus is on comedy, and so a lot of the cases have silly reveals or, ridiculous plot lines as it turns out. And of course, the dynamic between the main two characters is very funny because Goriki Ayame's character is essentially bribing Tamaki Hiroshi's character to stay involved with a case when he would otherwise, just let the police figure that out. I want to go make money from, someone hiring me as a private investigator to see if their spouse is having an affair. But she convinces him by offering money and cheap rent, because she's a landlord, to continue looking into these cases that she wants to be as dramatic as the mystery novels she reads. And she's part of a university mystery club society that talks out the cases, and her friends in that society often have as insane speculations and hypotheses as she does. In any case, there's a couple moments along the way, and I'm thinking of one in particular, when the client in a case has lost his dog, whose name's Stephanie, which I think is a hilarious name for a dog. It's the kind of name that, yes, there are many animals that have human type of names, but they tend to be a bit more rare, and before I had seen this, I'd never heard a dog called Stephanie. It's just an objectively funny name. But over the course of the episode, you find out that actually he's disappeared, the client who hired him, and so they're trying to figure out what happened and also maybe see if they can find Stephanie. And Stephanie is thankfully eventually found, but the client is not found alive. And there's a moment near the end when they realize that the client, when he was killed, was out looking for his dog. And at first, some of the people are like, like, why would he be out at that hour when it's, winter weather and, it was maybe dangerous for an old man to be walking around the streets. And Goriki Ayame's character, who is very funny, she has these crazy hypotheses. She doesn't know, like a more logical or grounded sense of reasoning in most cases. But when it comes to the emotional underpinning of a case, she's always the one that seizes on the correct view, whereas Tamaki Hiroshi's character, often has a distorted understanding because his maybe emotional maturity is in that one way specifically not as developed as hers, and others around, again, even the formal investigators from the police who get involved in a lot of the cases, they don't quite know how to see it, and then Goriki Ayame's character will hit on the right understanding. And she says, well, of course he was out looking for Stephanie, even though it was snowy weather and it was dark and he, maybe was in a position where he could get hit by a car, because that's his family member. That's someone he loves and he was trying to find. And when that moment comes, this track, which translates to, and I want to make sure I have this right, because it's one of the ones that on the back of the box set is not written in English, but yes, it translates to "Please Give Me Your Tears." So even though the show overall is not a heavily emotional show, and there's not really moments where it's like, oh wow, like the emotional gravity of that, there are a couple moments that at least in the context of this show touch on the heartstrings a little bit, and this track often plays. Now, it actually also plays in some moments where it's a bit ironic because the emotional pain or the desire for tears is within the context of Goriki Ayame's character saying, oh, this would be great for a TV drama. And if this was a TV drama, he would talk about his sad backstory that led him to commit the crime, and we should all listen to that because, we're here and we're making a drama that's just like a detective novel or a TV show, to which Tamaki Hiroshi's character is always like, well, I don't want to do that. That's ridiculous. This is real life. I'm out of here. And she usually follows him but says, like, sorry, I know, like, he should have stayed and listened to the backstory. And maybe even the criminal is like, wait, like, I was just, divulging this painful story that should give you a sense for why I did what I did. Shouldn't he have to listen? They're like, no, I'm sorry, he left. We're going to put you in handcuffs now. So it does play in more ironic circumstances. But in that one episode where you find out why Stephanie's owner was out and was ultimately killed, it hits a little more sincerely. So in any case, this tune, the soundtrack for this one is done by two different people, and it lists all the tunes done by one or the other. This one is done by the mononymic Mayuko. So in the moment, I don't remember anything about this composer specifically, but as I said, all the tracks done by one or the other are listed here. So as we go through this over the following weeks and months, we will, of course, be able to distinguish which composer worked on which track. In any case, as I said, this is from The Private Detective I Don't Like, also called Addicted to Mystery, from 2014, and one of the series composers, Mayuko, a track called Please Give Me Your Tears. instruments in there. So clearly the main melody is provided by, at least the melody after the initial atmosphere is created, is provided by a woodwind. I don't know if it's an oboe or a clarinet. I'm going to guess oboe. But then eventually we do hear strings. I think we hear a flute, maybe even a harp along the way, as well as, is a celesta? I don't know exactly what that was. The plinky keyboard line, which doesn't quite sound like a harpsichord, but doesn't sound like a straightaway piano either. Now, of course, it could be a keyboard that just has a particular kit, but even then I would say it's clearly supposed to sound like a particular keyed instrument, though I'm not sure which one that is. Nevertheless, it is a very well-constructed tune, and although I think it sounds more or less straight away when you hear it in this moment, I do think also there's a, not lightness, but there's less of a weight compared to some of the emotional tunes in, let's say, a more straight-away detective story, where when you learn about the painful backstory of the people involved or the damage that the criminal caused in other people's lives, there's a greater gravity and a pain to it that comes across. So this one, it feels like it's in a similar territory, but appropriate to the lighter comedic show that it comes from. Even if I will say the last minute or so has more tension in the strings, it has a bit more of a complicated feeling, whereas the beginning, again, it's light, or again, maybe light isn't the right word, but it's sweeter sounding than the latter half, which again has a bit more of a conflicted type of sound. In any case, as I said, it's from a show that is primarily comedy, and comedy coming from all different directions, so it fits that it's not crazy heavy or pained in its atmosphere, but I do think, again, in that one episode in particular, it hits with a bit of emotional impact. So ultimately, I am going to continue to go through this soundtrack. I don't know, my brain just froze up for a minute there. But ultimately, I will have to make sure I'm, number one, checking to see which of the two composers individual tracks are from, and in several cases, in fact, most of the cases, I think there's only one or two tracks on the back here that are written in English, one being I Hate a Detective, which of course fits with the private detective that I don't like translation of the title. Most of them are in kanji or katakana or hiragana, so they will have to be translated, and of course, when I put them into a translator, the nuance of the phrase or word in question may be lost a little bit or distorted, so probably not as much as the subtitles from the later episodes of the show, but at the very least, I will provide the translated titles with a bit of a grain of salt or asterisk. In any case, let me know what you think. I will see you next time. Peace.